Great to see those who can come back out tonight. Great to see everyone. Appreciate your presence. And again, it's good to be here to be your speaker. I mentioned this morning that one of the things I like to do is just take a song and kind of work my way through it. You know, really in reality, some of the best sermons, I guess, come from songs. And that makes sense because our songs are based upon scriptural concept. In fact, the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 3 and Colossians 5, or Colossians 3 and Ephesians 5, speaks of speaking to ourselves, or communicating with ourselves to ourselves in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And I think those are really beautiful words. We typically use those words to demonstrate how that we use only vocal music in the church, and that's very true, of course. But there's a lot more to those passages than just that, because I think what Paul is getting at there is the type of praise we use is a spiritual praise. It comes from an instrument that only God can make, and that's the heart, the mind, the spirit, that then we give back to God in words or in music, shall we say. I think probably, the early church understood that as well. In fact, scholars tell us that the early church would have used the Psalms, the Old Testament Psalms, as their songbook. And I suspect that, much like they do in Europe today, you might have just a few tunes, and you might put those Psalms to a very few tunes. Not every Psalm had their own tune, but nonetheless, there is some beautiful sentiment in the Psalms. And I don't know how we would do it today because, people know music and people are more perhaps structured, but I thought, wouldn't it be neat if we could just sing the Psalms? And I think the sentiment in some of those songs is just beautiful. But, sometimes as we go through the service, maybe at the end of the service, someone says, well, what did the speaker speak on? And you kind of, I don't really know. And maybe he didn't really know either sometimes what he spoke on, but he spoke. But you don't get much out of it. And, of course, that's maybe their fault or our fault or whose ever fault. But, a lot of times songs, though, will stick in our minds. And so we will leave the building humming a song, or something will come to our mind, through the week, a religious song, and it kind of gets stuck in our head. Music is extremely powerful. In fact, many, many years ago now, I was at someone's house, and we played this game. I don't even recall the name of it. But it went back to all of the songs, secular, that you knew when you were a teenager. And so it had like 60s, 70s, 80s, whatever. And it was amazing how many songs I could just quote from having heard them on the radio. Now, unfortunately, some of the lyrics weren't so good. But songs, because they have rhythm and because they have music, they get stuck in your head. In fact, you'll sort of appreciate this because I know you have a history with Clint. But Clint and I can just carry on a conversation sometimes with songs. He'll roll off a line, I'll roll off a line, and back and forth. And, that because songs get stuck in your head. Well, for me, our songbooks are really a treasure trove of sentiment. Now, I'm not big into Southern gospel. I don't necessarily love the type of songs we sometimes sing as far as the music. I'd probably go back to Gregorian chant if it was left up to me. But then again, I'm old-fashioned and I'm, kind of stuck in the mud. But some of the songs are just really beautiful. In fact, we've sung some today that I thought, man, I need to work that into a sermon or something. But a few years ago, and this wasn't written by one of our brothers that I know of, rather, but Stuart Townsend in number 2 in the book here, wrote a song, this has been a lot of years ago now, How Deep the Father's Love. And I remember that when that song came out, I thought, this guy, whoever he is, and I've looked him up and I've listened to other songs and lyrics that he's written, but he really encapsulates what I would think would be the old Reformation style words. There's a lot of theology in his words. There's a lot of depth and a lot of beauty. And this song came out and I just couldn't help, and it's been years since I've done this, but go through this song and preach it because it's so incredibly gorgeous. And so that's what I want to do with you tonight. It's not really a sermon. It's more of a line-by-line analysis. And I didn't write this song, so I can't tell you exactly what the author meant. That's one of the disconnects that we have when we sing songs. The author may have meant something different than what we think he meant. But I think that that's okay. There's a bit of a poetic license you can have on either the hearer or the giver's part. And I think it's very helpful sometimes just to go through the songs that we sing. And so when you leave here today, you may not, remember much, but think about the songs that you sing in worship. Think about the songs that maybe you've taught your children. And by the way, that's a great thing to do. Teach children songs that they then get stuck on their head, because that's teaching them even when you can't. But this song, first of all, the title's wonderful. How Deep the Father's Love. How deep is the Father's love? I mean, we talk about Calvary, we talk about Christ's sacrifice, we talk about His miracles, we talk about His life, we talk about the things that He did even before we came along in being the person that was there with God during creation. His, love for us, both Christ and God and the Holy Spirit, is incredible. We have probably an approximation of love. God is the ultimate source of love. But we have affinity for others. We have love for our children. We have affinity toward things sometimes. Maybe we love them sometimes too much, our things. But we understand, and more probably from an emotional standpoint, the love that we have for others or for our children. Now, I think God feels that too. I think God has an emotional connection to us. I think He wants our company. I think He wants our fellowship. I think we saw that in the garden when He would come down and walk and talk with Adam and Eve. In fact, I think that's the reason He created Adam and Eve, at least one of the reasons, so He could have fellowship. But I also think that God's love is so superior to ours that sometimes we can't comprehend it. The Greeks had 4 words, at least, for love. They had agape, storge, eros, and phileo. And agape is arguably kind of that higher love of decision making. And I think God has that for us too. In other words, it's not necessarily an emotional decision God makes on our behalf or whatever, but it's for our own good. For example, we have love sometimes for our spouse, even when our spouse is not lovable. And so that love is a decision process. And I think a lot of the spiritual characteristics, especially over in Galatians 5, where you find those spiritual fruits of love, joy, peace, long-suffering, all those are decisions of the mind as much as they are emotion. So when we think about the love of God, how deep the Father's love for us, I want us to think about it personally, and then I also want us to think about it not only on the emotional side, but also on the decision-making side. God, for example, John 3:16, so loved the world that He gave. That is the decision. He didn't just say, I love you, but He sent, He gave, He sacrificed for us. And so Stuart says this, he says, how deep the Father's love for us? Well, again, how can you answer that question? The love of God is higher than the mountains. It's deeper than the ocean. It is beyond the universe. We cannot put it in a bottle. We cannot put it in a test tube. We cannot measure it. But he says, how vast beyond all measure. We like to measure things in life. We like to quantify and qualify things. How much do you love me? Oh, I love you to the moon and back. I don't even understand that one. But nonetheless, what does that mean? Well, I guess it means if you go to the moon, you're still going to love that person. But God, we can't quantify or qualify His love. We can't put it in a way that really we can comprehend. I think we approximate it. I think we talk about things that help us understand, even the cross, the love of God. But I don't know if we can really understand it. Because God created us. I mean, He's the potter, we're the clay, and it's something we cannot fully comprehend. So the question then is asked, which is an eternal question, how deep is this love for us? But then he goes on, and he shows us at least one example of that. He says that He should give His only Son to make a wretch His treasure. Now that's love. The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 5 says, for scarcely for a righteous man would one die, peradventure for a good man some would even dare to die, but God commendeth His love for us in that while we were yet sinners, or Christ commended His love for us, and while we were yet sinners, Christ died for the ungodly. God didn't have to send His Son. Jesus didn't have to come. The whole history of man would have been much different. God could have said, enough already. You sinned in the garden. I gave you a perfect chance. You didn't take it. Therefore, you're done. But you read Ephesians 1, there seems to be, in that whole idea of predestination, and I do believe in predestination in the biblical sense, that God knew we were going to sin, and before the foundation of the world, He already had devised a plan to save us. Now that's love. It may not be what we think of as emotional, love or, infatuation, but it's decision love. It's a love that says, this creature that I created is so valuable that I will even sacrifice my son for them. And that's just something I don't think we can even comprehend. Jesus looked down on us. God looked down on us. And I don't know what conversation, if any, went on in heaven. But Jesus came, and Stuart says, that He should give His only Son to make a wretch His treasure. When I think of a wretch, I think of the Old English. I think of the Old English word where, something is wretched, it's poor. Well, John uses this in Revelation. The wretched, poor, and miserable. Where it's just not worth anything. It's dirty, it's nasty. There's nothing that it can offer you that is pleasurable. And yet that's what we were. Because that's what sin does. Even our at best is unsuitable for God. In fact, the old prophet in the Old Testament says, our righteousness is as filthy rags. And that's the idea of, some pretty nasty stuff, but it's never going to approach the holiness of God. Even the best that we do will never live up to God's perfect standard. And of course, that's the reason we have grace. That's the reason we have mercy. That's the reason we have the gospel. That's the reason we have forgiveness. That's the reason we have repentance. All of those things. Incredible that God would allow us to have a way to always get back in good graces, if you will, to Him. And then he says in this stanza, he says, how great the pain of searing loss. Now I want to stop there for a moment, because think about what God lost and think about what Jesus lost. Now, God's eternal, so I don't know that time is very, important as far as the length of time necessarily, but God sent His Son. For at least, 33 years, Jesus was not in heaven. He was on earth. And Jesus gave up the prerogatives of heaven to be here in a world that was just filled. He gave it up being a garbage dump, to be honest with you. Jesus came to a garbage dump. When I was in Africa a few years ago, we tramped around Dar es Salaam through the slums, preaching the gospel. And there were places where you didn't even want to put your feet on the ground. It was that nasty. Well, think about that in relationship to God, who looks down on this world, or at least could, and say, that's a sinful place. I don't want to taint my holiness by sending me or my son or anything related to deity to this nasty world of sin, sorrow, and shame, and have Him tramp around there in sandals nonetheless and get dirty. But that's the interesting irony. Jesus did not get dirty. Jesus came down and He did tramp around in a world with sin and shame, but He never became sin and shame. And I think that's the difference. You see, Jesus came and He said, here's the paradigm. Here's the perfection that I want to show you. Jesus was incarnate. He was Emmanuel, God with us. So when you saw Jesus, you saw God. In fact, in John 14, one of the apostles said, show us the Father. And Jesus said, have I been with you so long and you say, show us the Father? He says, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. So Jesus was indeed the very image of God here on this nasty earth, but He never was tainted. He wasn't tainted when He ate with the Pharisees. He wasn't tainted when somebody with the disease came up and touched Him. He was never ceremonially unclean. But Jesus came to a world that was. And He died for us. And so there is this searing loss that Jesus had and gave up. And I think for the joy that was set before Him, He endured the shame and, He went to the cross. He did that out of love for us. But then what happened on the cross? Well, the author says, the pain of searing loss, the Father turned His face away. That's a really interesting theological debate and question about what happened on the cross. There's those 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross, and the first one is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And of course, that's a quotation from Psalm 22, which is actually a psalm of victory if you read the whole thing. It is indeed a psalm of despair in the beginning, but at the end of it, David turns it around and says, but he will hear us. He will respond. And so there's this question of, what is Jesus doing with that psalm? But, for all intents and purposes, it was dark for 3 hours. And Jesus hung upon the cross for those 6 hours, and there was darkness. And it did look like the Father turned his face away. And that brings up again the question of how does deity turn its face on deity? I don't know all the particulars, all the theological implications or nuances of that particular phrase. But I think Stuart Townsend hit it when he said, it was a dark day. The Father turned his face away. And how can that happen? Well, I don't know how it can happen, but I know why it happened. It happened because God loved you and God loved me. And he allowed Jesus to become the sin sacrifice for us. We couldn't do it. We were the sinner after all. And so Jesus said, I'll come. Behold, John 1:29, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. He would be the Lamb that would give us what we could not offer for ourselves. The searing loss, the Father turns his face away. As wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. The wounds that Jesus suffered on the cross. The 5 wounds. That is right? 5? The 5 wounds. The nails, the spear. They were the very avenue. They were the river. A river of blood that brought many sons to glory. That's a reference back to a passage, I believe, in the book of Hebrews. But nonetheless, we are sons and daughters of God. Jesus came as the Son of God so that we could become a son and daughter of God. We'll never be the singular, the only begotten Son, but we are the children of God. Again, behold what manner, John says this, behold what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the children of God. Being a child, especially if your parent is a really good parent or whatever the case might be, is an honor. It's an honor to be a child of someone. They chose ostensibly out of love to have you and to care for you and to raise you. And therefore, of course, we honor them in return. But we are sons and daughters of God. That is the most incredible, deep, precious, valuable relationship that this world, while we're in it, can offer. And then he takes us to the cross in verse 2. He says, behold the man upon the cross. Now, he's got this word man capitalized. I don't know what he meant by that. But now, Jesus is not only a man, he is the man. Because in Jesus, we have really deity incarnate. I mentioned Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus is the man. In fact, the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 2 speaks of the mediator. He says there's one mediator between God and man. And then he says the same thing. He says the man, Christ Jesus. Why does he say man? Well, because it took humanity to die for humanity. It took Jesus, who was man, he was fully God, but also fully flesh, to understand what we go through. I mentioned this morning Hebrews 4. We have a high priest that is and can be touched with the feelings of our infirmities. He knows what we go through. And so here's this man, although they saw him only as a man. Pilate didn't see him as a son of God, or at least not, arguably he didn't address him as that. He says, behold the man upon the cross. That was, again, a representation of every man, of every woman, of every human dying for us. And then he says, my sin upon his shoulders. Do you ever feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders? It's really not, but we feel that way sometimes. Even our minor problems can feel very burdensome, and our shoulders, as it were, metaphorically get tired. And think about Jesus. Someone asked me one time, they said, why do you think that Jesus only had a ministry of 3.5 years? And I said, well, there's prophecy, of course, that prophesied that, so that was good enough for me. But then we got to conjecturing. I said, well, think about this. How much could one individual take in his connection and in his bearing the grief and the burdens of humanity? I mean, Jesus bore that ostensibly all of his life, but for those 3.5 years that he was in his ministry, He was taking upon himself every day from light to dark, the pains, the suffering, the sickness of the world. And now he's in the garden, or he's on the cross rather, and he is taking upon himself the sins of the world. In the garden, Jesus had said, Father, if there's any way at all, let this cup of suffering pass from me. And he sweated, as it were, great drops of blood. I think the pressure was incredible on Jesus. Probably so much that it might be a wonder that he didn't die earlier. But yet he's on the cross. Sin is now he is becoming the sacrifice for our sin. I don't think Jesus literally became sin, by the way. I think he became the sin sacrifice for us. Because if Jesus becomes sin, then that would have been a sinner dying. No, it took a perfectly righteous person to die. But Jesus bore the weight, the guilt of our sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed, it says then, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. Now that phrase really gets to me. Because I have to ask myself, and maybe you do too, if you were there on the steps where Pilate ultimately condemned Jesus, or you were there at the cross, and you saw Jesus, as was mentioned, with 3 crosses, Jesus in the middle. The Romans knew how to crucify people because they were scoundrels, criminals, whatever. What would we have thought about Jesus? What would we have thought? What would we have said? Peer pressure is a big thing. Sometimes, even though I don't necessarily believe something, I'll go along with certain ideas or crowd because I don't want to ruffle any feathers. Again, what would we have done? Could we hear ourselves in the mocking voices? He saved others, but himself he cannot save. If he's the Son of God, let him come down. Would we have said that? Would we have been part of the crowd crying that out? Or would we have been sitting there going, yeah? I hope not. But you know what? That's human nature. And there were people there crying out. And if we're honest with ourselves, I think we can often see ourselves as traitors at times, just like these individuals were. Why? Because we look at Jesus and we still sin. We still reject him. Isn't that the same as what was going on at the cross? And so, we're there sometimes, all too often, crying out among the scoffers. And then he says, it was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. There's been this argument, theologically, for centuries about who killed Jesus. Well, there's a lot of theories, and a lot of them have some merit. Some people say, well, the Jews killed Jesus or murdered Jesus. Well, yes, they were the ones who, brought him up to the Romans. Some people say, well, the Romans were the ones who really did it because the Jews couldn't crucify someone without Roman consent, and I guess that's true. So maybe it's the Romans, or maybe it's Pilate, or maybe, it's, any number of things. What put Jesus to death? Well, you say, well, Jesus, he allowed himself to go to the cross. John 10, Jesus said, no man takes my life from me, I lay it down of myself. But really ultimately, what kept Jesus on the cross was our sin and his love for us in taking away those sins. So, you and I have a part in that crucifixion scene and in nailing Jesus to the cross. Well, how long was he there? As long as it took, until it was accomplished. Now, that's an interesting conundrum too, because, Jesus cried out, it is finished. But it almost seems like Jesus knew at a certain point when he would yield up his spirit back to God. Not before that time could anyone could anyone succeed in killing him. But Jesus laid down his life. In Luke 4, they tried to kill Jesus. They tried to throw him off of the cliff in Nazareth, and Jesus somehow escaped. People often were trying to trap Jesus and get him killed, but it was not going to happen until Jesus said it was time, or until God's timetable could be fulfilled. And then he says, his dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. That also has a lot of irony because it is the dying breath of Jesus that brought life. It was the breath of God that brought physical life in the beginning. God breathed into man's nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living being. Now, Jesus' dying breath and death is that which gives us spiritual life. It's an interesting concept to chew on for a while. And then he says, I know that it is finished. Well, Stuart Townsend here is talking about, what Jesus said on the cross. The last of his 7 sayings was, it is finished. And that's a whole sermon in and of itself, but just think about this. It is finished. What was finished? His life? Well, his physical life at that moment, yes, was going, but he would rise again, so it is finished. The law? Yeah, Jesus nailed the law to the cross. The animal sacrificial system? Yes. In fact, in just about 40 years, God would for sure show that in AD 70. What is finished? The work, really, everything, the whole package that God sent him to do. It is finished. Jesus accomplished everything. Scholars tell us that when a sculptor or an artist or a writer would finish a book or a story or a work of art or even a building, there was a phrase called tetelestai. I think I'm pronouncing that correct. Tetelestai means it's finished. Or when a bill was paid, you would stamp it with a paid in full tetelestai. That's the word that's used in the scriptures of Jesus' statement. It's done. There's nothing more to do as far as the plan of salvation is concerned. Well, very quickly, let's talk about this last verse just for a moment. He says, I will not boast in anything. No gifts, no power, no wisdom. He's obviously here referring to the Apostle Paul. Paul, both in Philippians and in Corinthians, speaks of his right to boast. He says, I can boast of the hardships I've gone through. He said, I was schooled under Gamaliel. I was raised in a Jewish family. I was a rabbi. I kept the law, blamelessly. But what does that get you? What do all of our successes get us in life? Maybe some money, maybe some acclaim, maybe a job, maybe a little stability or status, but it won't get salvation. That's not where salvation comes from. Paul understood that. He understood that his own righteousness could never get it done. He was not self-righteous. He didn't depend on himself. And that's what the song is trying to get across. We can boast in everything, but that means nothing. Not only does it not mean anything, as far as our salvation, as far as physical, material things, but it's not going to mean anything when we come to our deathbed either. It's like the old preachers used to say, you never saw a hearse hauling a U-Haul. Because all that stuff that we've accumulated, guess where it goes? Somebody else, or into the dump, or whatever. So, in view of what Jesus gave for us, we have no reason to boast. No gifts, no power, no wisdom, nothing, whether it's physical, material, or spiritual, or even, educationally, can really compare to what God has given us. But he says, I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Now, the boasting that here he's referring to is, again, back to Paul. Paul would say in Corinthians, I don't want to know anything among you except for Jesus Christ and him crucified. And that doesn't mean that Paul didn't teach doctrine. Of course he did. But the whole understructure, the whole, foundation of everything that Paul taught was Jesus Christ and him crucified. And if Paul was going to boast, it was in what God did, not what he did. It was in what God did through Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And then he says, why should I gain from his reward? In other words, who are we again? He kind of starts back where he was in the beginning of this song. Who are we? How do we deserve this? Sometimes you'll see a young man and he's not so handsome. He's a little homely and he's got a beautiful lady on his arm. You think, man, how did he merit that? Or you'll see maybe someone who you thought was a ne'er-do-well, and he's got this beautiful house and everything's going well. How did he merit that? Well, I don't know. Maybe he didn't marry it. No, he might have married it, but maybe he didn't merit it. But we certainly don't merit the blessings of God. You are a child of God. I am a child of God. We have food, clothing, shelter. Jesus has promised to listen to our prayers and then, of course, be our mediator. We don't deserve that. Nothing. And even though we might be very religious, even though we might be a member of the Church of Christ, even though we might be worshiping correctly, even though we might be living righteously, we still don't deserve what God has given us. There is, in fact, the first beatitude, I'm going off on a rabbit trail now. The first beatitude in Matthew chapter 5 is, blessed are the poor in spirit. That beatitude literally has the idea of someone who is so poverty-stricken when it comes to spiritual worth that he just throws himself on the ground and says, I have nothing to offer you, God. You got to do it for me because I can't bring anything to you that you need or that is of any value to you. Poverty, destitution of spirit. It's not what we do a lot of times. Sometimes we come and say, God, you need to look at me. Remember Luke 18, where you have, Luke 18, where you have, the two men who went up to the temple to pray. Lord, I thank you that I'm not like other men are, unjust, extortioners, or even like that sinner over there. No. We come to God totally understanding we rely totally on Him. And then he says, I will boast in Jesus Christ. Why should you? Okay. And then as we finish up, I cannot give an answer as to, again, why I should gain this reward. But this I know with all my heart, His wounds have paid my ransom. You know, that phrase, this I know with all my heart, I was thinking about it while I was kind of glancing through this book, trying to find a song to talk about. Do we really know that? I mean, do we really have faith and belief that Jesus did save us from our sins? If we do, then that's going to take away a lot of guilt. If we do, then it's going to empower us to live for Him. Do we really believe it? Because you see, beliefs have consequences. And this song is, is the affirmation of, I know this with all my heart. Well, when we know something with all our heart and we're really into it, it will manifest itself. And what was it he knew? His wounds have paid my ransom. And again, this goes back to maybe the idea of self-righteousness because, I know in theology there's always a tension. Faith, works, there's always a tension in every theological paradigm. We can't earn our salvation. Nothing we do earns it. Now, there are requirements. There are responsibilities. But we have to, at some point, just say, God, you did this for me. You gave me this chance. I may respond to you, but you're the one who responded first. The idea of us, and this is what humanity does. Humanity wants to build a tower to heaven. That's what the people at Babel did. We want to sort of grab our bootstraps and pull ourselves up to God. It won't work. So God descended to us. That's the whole point of this song, is God sent Jesus to us. Otherwise, we would have never known, really, what God was like. God came down to the garden with Adam and Eve. Otherwise, how would they have ever known the nature of God? We can't reach up to God and say, okay, I'm going to climb the ladder and get to you. No, He came down to us. And that, again, it may sound, like that could go off into the weeds pretty quick, and it could, but that's the truth of the matter. And so, when we look at what Jesus did, how deep the Father's love, He came here to die for us. Well, I could ramble on, but that's a beautiful song, and I would hope that as you sing it or other songs, you would just listen to the lyrics and think about the depth of some of these words, and take those with you through the week. If you're here this evening and we can assist you in any way in the gospel obedience, we'll be happy to do that while we stand and while we sing.